One of the most unfortunate medieval discoveries was also one of the least reversible. The human body is extremely easy to open and extremely bad at being put back together. Once medieval scholars began studying anatomy with any seriousness, they realized that humans were not in fact designed with maintenance in mind. Early dissections revealed a body arranged like a poorly packed travel bag. Organs were stacked tightly together, soaked in fluids no one could identify, all performing vital tasks that nobody understood. Surgeons could confidently announce, "This is the liver," in the same way someone today might say, "This is a mysterious cable behind the television that you should not unplug." Unfortunately, they unplugged it anyway. The first recorded public dissection in medieval Europe took place at the University of Bologna in 1315. A physician named Mondino de Lucy stood before a crowd of students and opened the chest cavity of an executed criminal. What he found inside did not match the ancient texts everyone had memorized. The heart was not where Galen said it should be. The liver had the wrong number of lobes. The stomach refused to align with Aristotle's descriptions. This should have been revelatory. Instead, Mondino concluded that the body in front of him was simply wrong. The text, after all, had been copied for 1,000 years. This particular corpse was clearly defective. So he continued teaching from the books while occasionally gesturing toward the contradictory evidence lying open on the table. This pattern repeated across Europe. Dissection became more common, but understanding advanced slowly. Because medieval medicine operated under a specific constraint, knowledge was inherited, not discovered. If your observations contradicted authority, the observations were suspect. Still, some things became impossible to ignore. The digestive system was a vertical passage, not the lateral maze described in ancient manuscripts. Blood vessels didn't spiral in perfect geometric patterns. The brain was not, as previously believed, primarily responsible for cooling the body. These corrections accumulated gradually, but the practical applications lagged far behind. This discovery didn't improve medicine overnight. It improved confidence. And confidence, when combined with knives and no anesthesia, is a dangerous cocktail. Medieval surgeons now felt entitled to cut, poke, drain, and experiment, armed with just enough knowledge to be wrong in exciting new ways. Barber surgeons, the working-class practitioners who actually performed most operations, developed a reputation for speed. The fastest could amputate a leg in under 2 minutes. This wasn't skill for show, it was mercy. Because pain, meanwhile, was considered educational. If the patient screamed, that meant they were still alive and paying attention. Anesthesia did not exist. Alcohol helped. Opium helped more when available. But true unconsciousness during surgery was not an option. Hygiene existed only as a rumor. The same apron was worn for weeks. The same tools were used on multiple patients without cleaning. Infection was expected. Survival was negotiable. Speed was the goal. Accuracy was optional. A successful surgery meant the patient lived long enough to leave the table. What happened in the days after the fever, the suppuration, the slow decline that was God's territory? The surgeon had done his part. If the patient survived, the surgeon was praised. If the patient died, everyone nodded thoughtfully and said, "God works in mysterious ways," before scheduling the next procedure. The discovery also ruined comforting illusions. People learned just how thin the line between living and dying really was. A bad cut, a dirty blade, a curious apprentice who leaned in too close. Suddenly, the human body didn't look like a miracle. It looked like a sack of extremely important liquids under mild pressure. The French surgeon Henri de Mondeville, writing in the early 14th century, noted that most patients died not from the surgery itself, but from what came after. He recommended keeping wounds clean, covering them with bandages soaked in wine, and preventing relatives from visiting too often. His colleagues ignored him. Wine was expensive, bandages required effort, and relatives paid the bills. Worst of all, medieval Europe discovered that knowing where organs are does not mean knowing what to do with them. This did not slow anyone down. Instead, it encouraged further experimentation. More cutting, more notes, more regret. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull, became surprisingly common. It was used to treat headaches, seizures, mental illness, and demonic possession. The logic was simple. Bad spirits needed an exit. Bone was in the way. Remove the bone. Some patients survived. Their skulls show clear evidence of healing bone growing back around the edges of the hole. They lived months, sometimes years after the procedure. Others did not, but the failures were easy to explain. The demons had been too strong. The patient's faith too weak. The hole perhaps too small. Ironically, this discovery laid the groundwork for modern medicine. But at the time, it mostly laid people flat. Knowledge arrived centuries before safety ethics, or the revolutionary idea that maybe washing your hands was worth trying. Medieval physicians knew the body could be opened. They knew organs had names and approximate locations. They knew blood was important, though not exactly why. They knew the heart beat and the lungs moved and the stomach processed food. But the gap between knowing and understanding remained vast. The human body, it turned out, was designed to stay closed. Evolution had not prepared it for inspection. There were no instruction manuals inside, no helpful diagrams, just wet, complicated machinery that stopped working when exposed to air and questioned by men with inadequate tools. Medieval Europe learned something profound and deeply unsettling. Humans are fragile, temporary, and poorly assembled. And instead of backing away slowly, they leaned closer, knife in hand, and said, "Interesting." Once medieval Europe learned how the human body was assembled, it immediately asked the next logical question. Not how do we heal it, but how much of this can it take before it stops working? And thus began one of history's least necessary research projects, the precise measurement of human pain. Medieval authorities, physicians, and legal systems slowly discovered that pain was not random. It could be controlled, extended, applied in stages. You could hurt someone a little, a lot, or just enough to keep them conscious and regretting their decisions. This realization did not lead to compassion. It led to creativity. Punishment became experimental. Officials learned that breaking a bone was dramatic but inefficient. The prisoner passed out too quickly. Crushing was effective but messy, requiring cleanup and explanations to squeamish witnesses. Stretching worked wonderfully and left fewer visible marks, which meant the victim could be displayed afterward without offending public sensibilities. Every method was refined through trial error and an alarming amount of note-taking. The rack, perhaps the most famous stretching device, appeared in various forms across Europe starting in the 12th century. The principle was simple. Bind the prisoner's wrists and ankles to a wooden frame. Turn the crank. Apply tension gradually. The innovation was in the gradualness. Early torturers learned that sudden extreme force produced immediate unconsciousness, useless for extracting information. But slow incremental stretching kept the subject aware, articulate, and increasingly motivated to cooperate. The breaking point literally came when joints separated, shoulders first, usually then hips. The popping sound was distinctive. Observers noted it in their records with clinical detachment. The human body became a testing ground and the results were shared widely. This wasn't medieval chaos. It was medieval optimization. Executioners and torturers weren't amateurs. They were trained professionals, often members of guilds with apprenticeship programs and standards of practice. They knew exactly how to cause maximum suffering without accidentally killing the subject too early. Death was not the goal. The experience was. If someone died too fast, that was considered poor craftsmanship. A torturer's reputation rested on his ability to maintain consciousness, prolong confession, and deliver the prisoner to execution still capable of walking, or at least being dragged to the scaffold. The trade had its own technical vocabulary. There were degrees of application, stages of intensity, protocols for different crimes. A thief received different treatment than a heretic. A first offense merited less enthusiasm than a third. Pain also became educational. Confessions obtained under torture were considered reliable, which is fascinating because pain makes people say anything to make it stop. But logic was not the priority. Fear was. The legal principle was straightforward. Truth lived inside everyone. Sometimes it just needed encouragement to come out. Pain was that encouragement. What the legal system chose to ignore was that pain produced compliance, not accuracy. A prisoner being stretched on the rack would confess to witchcraft, treason, conspiracy, or Tuesday being a color if he thought it would stop the cranking. Authorities knew this, at least implicitly. But they had discovered something more useful than truth. They had discovered that watching pain was just as effective as experiencing it. Public punishments taught entire crowds to behave without needing to punish everyone individually, and people watched enthusiastically. Markets shut down. Families brought children. Vendors sold food nearby because nothing pairs better with civic discipline than a snack. Executioners scheduled punishments the way modern cities schedule festivals, with attention to weather, crowd capacity, and maximum visibility. Pain became a form of civic entertainment, carefully staged to remind everyone where power lived and how quickly it could visit them. The town square in Nuremberg had a permanent execution platform by the 15th century. It was built with elevated seating for officials, standing room for common citizens, and clear sight lines from surrounding windows. Architecture designed specifically for watching people die. Some cities charged admission. Not officially, but guards at favorable viewing positions were known to accept coins in exchange for not moving. Entrepreneurship found its niche. What made this discovery especially tragic was its confidence. Medieval society didn't see this as cruelty. It saw it as order. Pain was proof of justice. Suffering was evidence that the system worked. If someone screamed, it meant the law was being enforced. The Holy Roman Empire under Charles V codified this logic in the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532, one of the first comprehensive legal codes in Europe. It specified exactly which crimes merited torture, which methods were acceptable, and how many times a prisoner could be subjected to questioning under duress. The law did not ban torture. It regulated it, made it official, gave it procedure and precedent. The most unsettling part is that this knowledge stuck. Pain as a tool didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. It matured. It evolved. It learned to wear uniforms and speak calmly. Torture continued in European legal systems well into the 18th century. It was finally abolished not because societies became more moral, but because they developed more efficient methods of control. Surveillance, bureaucracy, imprisonment, techniques that didn't require screaming in public squares. The medieval world didn't just discover pain. It discovered how useful it was. And once that lesson was learned, it was never forgotten. The techniques changed. The tools became more sophisticated. The justifications evolved. But the underlying principle remained. If you want compliance, make the alternative unbearable. Medieval Europe proved it worked. And that proof outlived every castle, crown, and code of law that employed it. At some point in the Middle Ages, people began noticing a deeply inconvenient pattern. Whenever one person got sick, other people nearby had the audacity to get sick as well. This was not subtle. Entire households fell ill. Streets emptied. Villages developed the unsettling habit of coughing in unison. And slowly, reluctantly, medieval Europe made a discovery that would haunt it for centuries. Disease moves. This should have been a breakthrough, a moment of clarity, a chance to improve medicine. Instead, it sparked fear so intense it could have been bottled and sold as a household product. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by ships from the Black Sea. It reached Sicily first, then spread north through Italy into France, across the Channel to England. Within 5 years, it had killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. The numbers are difficult to verify because record-keeping collapsed along with everything else. But the pattern was unmistakable. The sick infected the healthy. The dying infected the living. Proximity meant danger. Once people realized illness spread between bodies, everyone became a potential threat. Neighbors stopped visiting. Families avoided the sick. Doors closed. Windows stayed shut. Cities responded by locking their gates and loudly insisting that whatever was happening outside was not their problem. Milan took this approach literally. When plague arrived in 1348, the city council ordered that any house containing a sick person be sealed immediately. Not quarantined, sealed. Boards nailed across doors and windows. The sick, the healthy, the servants, the children, everyone inside was left to die or recover without assistance. Food was not delivered. Doctors did not visit. Priests offered last rites from the street, shouting prayers through walls. The policy worked after a fashion. Milan's death rate was lower than other Italian cities, but the cost was counted in families entombed in their own homes, slowly starving or suffocating alongside the infected. Quarantine emerged not as a medical solution, but as a social reflex. If someone got sick, you sealed them in their house and hoped very hard. Food was sometimes delivered, sometimes not. Recovery was optional. Isolation was mandatory. The word quarantine itself comes from the Venetian 40 giorni, 40 days. Venice required ships arriving from plague-infected ports to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. The number came from biblical tradition, not medical observation. 40 days had symbolic weight. Moses, Jesus, the flood. It felt appropriate. Whether it actually stopped disease was secondary. The important thing was visible action, official procedure, the appearance of control, and then came blame. When no cure appeared, medieval societies did what humans do best under pressure. They blamed people. Outsiders, travelers, minorities, anyone different enough to be suspicious. The discovery of contagion didn't lead to treatment. It led to persecution. If disease had to come from somewhere, surely it came from them. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells. The logic was circular and insane. Why would they poison wells they also used? How would that explain Christians dying in cities without Jewish residents? Didn't matter. Entire communities were massacred. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349. In Basel, they were locked in a wooden building and set on fire. In Mainz, the Jewish quarter was burned to the ground with its inhabitants inside. The plague killed them anyway. Turns out murder doesn't stop bacteria. But persecution provided emotional relief. It gave fear a target. It transformed helplessness into action, even if the action was monstrous and ineffective. Ironically, the discovery did occasionally save lives. Avoiding contact reduced spread. Isolation slowed outbreaks, but no one understood why it worked. So every correct action was wrapped in superstition, fear, and deeply unhelpful rituals. Houses were fumigated with herbs. People waved incense. Aromatic compounds were burned in public squares. The theory was that plague traveled through bad air, miasma, corrupted atmosphere that could be detected by smell. If something smelled bad, it was dangerous. If something smelled good, it offered protection. This led to plague doctors, those famous figures in beaked masks walking through infected cities dressed like demented birds. The beak was stuffed with flowers, herbs, and spices. The idea was that breathing through aromatic substances would filter out the bad air. It didn't work, but it looked impressive. And in the absence of actual solutions, impressive theater was better than nothing. Prayers were shouted. Churches filled with desperate crowds, which only accelerated infection. God was begged for mercy. Flagellants wandered from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to atone for humanity's sins. Logic was optional. Medical professionals, if we can call them that, disagreed wildly. Some blamed bad air, others blamed planetary alignments. Saturn and Jupiter had been in conjunction in 1345. Mars was ascendant. Obviously, cosmic disorder was infecting earthly bodies. A few blamed moral failure, which is always comforting when you're coughing up your lungs. The plague was divine punishment for sin. Repent, and perhaps God would relent. None of this stopped disease, but it did create an impressive amount of paperwork. Universities held debates. Treatises were written. The medical faculty at Paris produced an official report in 1348 attributing the plague to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius, which had occurred on March 20th, 1345. The report was detailed, confident, and completely wrong. But it was official. And official explanations, even incorrect ones, were preferable to admitting no one had any idea what was happening. The most damaging part of this discovery wasn't fear of illness. It was fear of people. Once sickness became contagious in the public imagination, compassion quietly exited the room. Survival turned into separation. Parents abandoned sick children. Children fled dying parents. Priests refused to administer last rites. Doctors stopped making house calls. The social fabric didn't fray. It shredded. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence during the plague, described families burying their dead in gardens because cemeteries were full. Bodies stacked in pits with layers of lime. Mass graves dug outside city walls. He also described something worse, the collapse of human decency. Servants stealing from dying masters. Relatives looting houses before the bodies were cold. The sick dying alone not from plague, but from neglect, because everyone who might have helped had already run away. Medieval Europe didn't just learn that disease spreads. It learned how easily fear spreads faster. And once that lesson took hold, it became permanent. Every outbreak afterward followed the same pattern. Isolation, blame, persecution, ritual. The search for scapegoats to punish and external causes to avoid. The disease itself was almost secondary. The real discovery was social. Communities under stress will fracture. Fear will find enemies, and the people with the least power will be blamed for problems they didn't cause. That pattern, more than any specific plague, is what medieval Europe passed forward. Medieval people spent a long time believing air was harmless, invisible, tasteless, and generously supplied by God. It seemed safe enough. Then miners started collapsing, alchemists fainted, whole rooms made people sick. And slowly, with growing concern and very little understanding, medieval Europe discovered something deeply rude. The air itself could kill you. This discovery arrived quietly, usually in the form of someone not coming back out of a tunnel. Miners were among the first to notice. Certain shafts caused dizziness, confusion, and sudden death. Candles went out for no reason. Men staggered, dropped their tools, and lay down forever. The explanation was not lack of oxygen. That would have been far too sensible. Instead, the air was blamed on spirits, demons, or underground moods. The mines, it was decided, were cursed. Naturally, people kept mining. The silver mines at Kutna Hora in Bohemia, operational from the 13th century onward, were particularly deadly. Shafts descended hundreds of feet into the earth. Ventilation was minimal. Miners worked by candlelight, which consumed oxygen and produced carbon monoxide. When a candle went out, experienced miners knew to retreat immediately. But not everyone was experienced, and not everyone retreated fast enough. The bodies were recovered when possible. When not, they were left where they fell. The mine just continued deeper tunneling around the dead. No one questioned why certain areas were more dangerous than others. No one measured air composition or tested for gases. The explanation was simpler. Some parts of the earth were angry. You respected that anger, or you died. Alchemists had similar experiences. They mixed substances, heated them, leaned in close, and inhaled fumes that quietly rearranged their internal organs. If someone collapsed mid-experiment, it was usually interpreted as proof they were very close to a breakthrough. Apprentices were encouraged to take notes and step closer. Mercury vapor, sulfur dioxide, arsenic compounds lead fumes. Alchemical workshops were chemical weapons laboratories operated by people with no concept of toxicology. The goal was transformation. Lead into gold, base metal into noble, mortality into immortality. If the alchemist himself died in the process, well, that was irony, or divine judgment, or proof that he hadn't quite perfected the formula. Georg Agricola, the 16th century scholar who wrote De Re Metallica, one of the first comprehensive texts on mining and metallurgy, described the occupational hazards with clinical precision. Miners developed lung diseases. Their teeth fell out. They coughed constantly. Many died young. Agricola attributed this to corrupted air within the mines. He recommended ventilation shafts, though he didn't explain why they helped. He noted that some ores produced more dangerous air than others. He observed but did not understand. His book was illustrated with detailed woodcuts showing mining operations, smelting techniques, and ventilation systems. It was translated into multiple languages and used for centuries. But the underlying problem remained. Air could kill you. No one knew why, so precautions were inconsistent and explanations were mystical. This led to a fascinating working theory. Poisonous air was selective. If it killed you, you were weak. If it didn't, you were meant for greatness. Survival bias became a research method. The strong survived poisoned air. The weak did not. Therefore, strong people were naturally resistant to corruption. This logic applied not just to miners and alchemists, but to entire populations. Why did some cities suffer plague while others remained healthy? The air was different. Why? Because the people were different. Moral fortitude purified the atmosphere. Sin corrupted it. This theory was useless for prevention, but excellent for judgment. Cities made their own contribution to airborne danger. Tanners, dyers, metal workers, and butchers all produced fumes that turned neighborhoods into slow-motion hazards. Medieval towns were dense, smoky, and enthusiastic about burning things indoors. Tanning leather required soaking hides in urine, feces, and other delightful substances. The smell was unbearable. The fumes were toxic. Tanneries were typically built on the outskirts of towns downwind if possible, but outskirts in a medieval city might be 50 yards from the town center, and downwind assumed wind cooperated. On still days, the stench and vapor covered everything. Metalworking, particularly blacksmithing and foundry operations, filled the air with smoke, soot, and metal particulates. Respiratory disease was common among smiths. Lung capacity declined. Coughing became chronic. No one connected the work to the illness. It was just assumed that smiths, like miners, were tough men doing tough work. If they coughed, well, everyone coughed. Medieval air was smoky. That was normal. Ventilation was not a priority. If smoke filled the room, that simply meant the fire was working. Houses were built with central hearths and holes in the roof for smoke to escape. Except smoke doesn't always cooperate. Wind blew it back down. Rain made fires smolder. Families lived in semi-permanent haze. Respiratory infections were constant. Children grew up with scarred lungs. Chronic bronchitis was so common, it wasn't considered a disease, just part of life. The discovery that air could harm you didn't lead to safety measures. It led to rituals. Herbs were burned to clean the air. Bells were rung to disperse miasma. Windows were opened occasionally, just long enough to let the cold in and morale out. During plague outbreaks, authorities ordered bonfires lit in public squares. The theory was that large fires would purify the atmosphere, burning away the corrupted vapors that carried disease. It didn't work, but it gave people something to do. And in the absence of effective action, symbolic action felt better than nothing. Ironically, medieval people were half right. Air was dangerous, just not in the way they thought. Poisonous gases, fumes, and smoke slowly damaged lungs and shortened lives, all while remaining invisible enough to feel mystical. Carbon monoxide has no smell. Methane has no color. Sulfur dioxide irritates but doesn't immediately kill. These were invisible threats that medieval people encountered daily without recognition. The cruel irony is that medieval Europe learned the truth but not the explanation. Air could kill you, yes, but instead of asking how, they asked who offended it. And once you believe the air itself is angry, there is very little you can do to negotiate with it. Appeasement became the strategy. Prayers, offerings, avoiding certain places at certain times. The approach was religious, not scientific, and it persisted for centuries. Not because medieval people were stupid, but because the correct explanation required understanding chemistry, biology, and atmospheric science, tools they didn't have, concepts they couldn't access. So they worked with what they had: observation without theory, pattern recognition without mechanism. The air kills sometimes, therefore the air is dangerous sometimes. Avoid it when possible. Endure it when necessary. And if you die well, it was God's will. That was the best they could do. And in a way it worked. Not to prevent death, but to make death explicable. Medieval Europe didn't solve the problem of poisonous air, but they learned to live with it, which in the absence of solutions was the only option available. Now take a breath. Pour yourself something if you haven't already. We're not done yet. What we've covered so far are the discoveries that shaped how medieval people understood the body. How it worked, how it broke, how it could be opened, measured, and controlled. But understanding the body was only the beginning. Because once medieval authorities realized how fragile humans were physically, they started asking more dangerous questions. What about the mind? What about belief? What about the things people couldn't see but trusted anyway? The next set of discoveries didn't involve knives or diseases or poisoned air. They involved something quieter, something more permanent. They involved what people were willing to put inside their own bodies voluntarily. What they rubbed on their skin, what they drank, what they fed their children. All because it looked beautiful, or because someone in authority said it was good for them. Medieval Europe was about to discover that poison doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes recommended. Sometimes it comes wrapped in progress. And sometimes by the time you realize what it's doing to you, it's already too late. Let's continue. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we've been talking about medieval discoveries, the kind that seemed like progress at the time and looked like nightmares later. In the first part, we covered what happened when medieval Europe learned how the body worked, or thought it did. The cutting, the measuring, the systematic application of pain, the realization that disease moved and air could kill. All of that was about understanding what the body could endure. This part is different. This part is about what medieval people willingly put inside their bodies, what they swallowed, smeared, inhaled, and wore, all because someone told them it would help. The discoveries in this section didn't require force. They required trust. And that, as it turns out, made them far more dangerous. Let's begin. At some point in the Middle Ages, humanity made a bold decision to repeatedly handle, ingest, inhale, and admire mercury. Shiny liquid and mysterious mercury looked magical. It flowed like water, reflected light like a mirror, and refused to behave like any metal people had ever seen. Naturally, medieval thinkers concluded it must be good for you. This was a mistake. Alchemy, medicine, and cosmetics all embraced mercury with unearned enthusiasm. Alchemists believed it was the key ingredient in transformation, the soul of metal itself. Physicians prescribed it for skin diseases, digestive problems, and conditions that did not need mercury anywhere near them. Some doctors even recommended rubbing it into wounds, which is impressive confidence considering wounds already had enough problems. The logic behind mercury's medical use was rooted in ancient theory. The Greek physician Galen had proposed that health depended on balancing four humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness occurred when these humors fell out of alignment. Mercury, being liquid and mobile, was thought to flow through the body and restore balance. It could chase out disease the way water chases out dirt. This theory was elegant, intuitive, and completely wrong, but it persisted for centuries because it made sense within the conceptual framework available. If the body is a system of flows and balances, then introducing a flowing substance to rebalance it seems reasonable. Mercury became a medieval multi-tool. It was swallowed, smeared, inhaled, and worn. It was used to treat parasites, purify the body, and chase away illness. For syphilis, which appeared in Europe in the late 15th century, mercury became the standard treatment. Patients were placed in enclosed rooms with mercury heated over fires. The vapor filled the space. Patients inhaled it for hours, sometimes days. The treatment was called salivation because one of mercury's effects is excessive drooling. Patients would produce quarts of saliva. This was interpreted as the body expelling disease. In reality, it was mercury poisoning. The fact that patients began trembling, drooling, losing teeth, and slowly losing their grip on reality was interpreted not as a warning sign but as proof the treatment was working. The symptoms were unmistakable. Hands shook uncontrollably. Speech slurred. Mood swings became dramatic. Memory faded. And yet instead of saying, perhaps this liquid metal is poison, medieval medicine concluded, excellent. The illness is leaving the body violently. The phrase mad as a hatter originates from this period. Hat makers used mercury nitrate to treat felt. Prolonged exposure caused neurological damage. Hatters developed tremors, paranoia, and hallucinations. But since everyone in the profession exhibited similar symptoms, it was assumed to be a quirk of the trade, not a consequence of the materials. Alchemists fared no better. They heated mercury in enclosed spaces, inhaled the vapors, and wondered aloud why they felt dizzy, confused, and increasingly unwell. Apprentices collapsed. Masters died young. The response was not caution. It was curiosity. If mercury caused madness, perhaps madness was simply the price of knowledge. Paracelsus, the 16th century physician and alchemist, famously declared, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison." This was a profound insight. Dosage matters. But Paracelsus himself used mercury extensively in his medical practice, often in doses far exceeding safety. He believed that mineral-based medicines were superior to plant-based ones. Mercury, being a mineral, was therefore superior medicine. The fact that it killed people was unfortunate but acceptable. After all, disease also killed people. At least mercury fought back. This logic twisted as it was governed medical practice for centuries. Even beauty culture got involved. Mercury compounds appeared in cosmetics, promising clear skin and eternal youth. They delivered pale faces, damaged nerves, and an unsettling tendency to stare into nothingness. But at least the complexion looked nice for a while. Women applied mercuric chloride to their faces to achieve the fashionable pallor preferred in courts. The substance lightened skin by destroying melanin. It also destroyed skin cells, nerves, and eventually the kidneys and liver. Long-term use caused tooth loss, gum disease, tremors, and mental deterioration. But these effects took years to manifest. By the time a woman realized the cosmetic was killing her, she was already dependent on it. Stopping use meant watching her carefully cultivated complexion darken and coarsen. Continuing meant slow poisoning. Many chose continuation. The tragedy is that mercury felt like progress. It was tangible, dramatic, and visibly active. It moved, it reacted. It seemed powerful. Medieval people mistook activity for healing, a mistake humanity has made many times since. The Middle Ages didn't just discover mercury. They discovered how confidently people can poison themselves when something sparkles just enough to feel important. Mercury remained in medical use well into the 20th century. It was finally removed from most applications, not because medicine suddenly became wise, but because alternatives became available, and because the lawsuits became expensive. The lesson medieval Europe learned and then forgot and then relearned was simple. Just because something does something doesn't mean it does anything useful. Mercury acted on the body, powerfully, visibly, dramatically. But action is not the same as cure. That distinction, obvious in retrospect, was invisible in practice. Because when you're desperate, when disease is killing people, and no one has answers, anything that seems to do something is better than doing nothing, even if that something is poison. After mercury, medieval Europe looked around and said, surely we can't do worse than this. And then it discovered lead. Lead was soft, flexible, easy to shape, and stubbornly resistant to corrosion. In other words, it was perfect. Too perfect. Medieval craftsmen loved it. Plumbers loved it. Cooks loved it. Doctors loved it. Cosmetic makers loved it. If something needed to be held, poured, eaten from, painted with, or worn on the face, lead quietly volunteered. Lead pipes carried drinking water. Lead cups held wine. Lead plates served food. Lead glazes coated pottery. Lead powder whitened faces. Lead sheets lined roofs. It was everywhere, doing everything all at once. And at first it seemed harmless. The Romans had used lead extensively. Their aqueducts were lined with lead pipes. Their cookware was often lead-lined. They even added lead acetate to wine as a sweetener. They called it sugar of lead. The Romans also suffered from widespread lead poisoning, though they didn't make the connection. Historians examining skeletal remains from Roman sites have found lead concentrations far above safe levels. Some scholars have even suggested that lead poisoning contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire, though this theory is debated. What's not debated is that the Romans used a lot of lead and suffered a lot of neurological and reproductive problems. Medieval Europe inherited this tradition and expanded on it. Then people started feeling off. Memory faded, mood shifted, judgment weakened. People grew irritable, confused, sluggish. Some became infertile. Others developed chronic pain or strange illnesses that no one could explain. This was inconvenient. But medieval medicine handled inconvenience very well by ignoring it completely. Instead of questioning, lead doctors blamed bad air, imbalanced humors, weak morals, or divine displeasure. The idea that the everyday objects surrounding everyone might be slowly poisoning them was simply too inconvenient to consider. After all, lead was useful, and usefulness historically has always outranked safety. The economic argument was compelling. Lead was cheap and abundant. Replacing it with safer alternatives would cost money. Who would pay? And for what? A vague concern about symptoms that might have dozens of causes. Better to assume the problem lay elsewhere. Wine drinkers were especially unlucky. Lead was sometimes added intentionally to wine to sweeten it. The result tasted better and slowly damaged the nervous system. People drank more. Symptoms worsened. Conclusions were not drawn. The practice was common enough that it had a name, leaded wine. It was considered a sign of quality. Expensive wines were more likely to be leaded than cheap ones. The irony is that the wealthier you were, the more lead you consumed. Peasants drank from wooden or clay cups. Nobles drank from lead-lined goblets. Peasants ate from wooden bowls. Nobles ate from lead-glazed plates. Class became a predictor of exposure. And since nobles were already prone to inbreeding, political stress and rich diets adding lead to the mix created a cocktail of dysfunction. Some historians have speculated that the erratic behavior of certain medieval monarchs, the sudden rages, the paranoia, the cognitive decline, might have been exacerbated by chronic lead exposure. Impossible to prove, but plausible. Even children were affected. Lead exposure dulled learning, slowed development, and altered behavior. But medieval society didn't track childhood development. Children were small adults with worse survival odds. If something went wrong, fate was blamed and everyone moved on. The most unsettling part is that the evidence was visible. Chronic lead exposure left signs: tremors, mental decline, emotional instability. Yet the connection remained unmade for centuries. Not because people were stupid, but because the answer threatened too many systems at once. Plumbing, craft, trade, medicine, beauty, architecture. Lead was embedded in daily life. Removing it would have required admitting that progress had been poisoning people quietly and efficiently. So medieval Europe kept using it, confidently, repeatedly, everywhere. The discovery of lead's usefulness outpaced the discovery of its danger. And by the time the truth caught up, generations had already paid the price. Lead didn't just make things easier, it made everything worse. One case stands out, though. Records are sparse. Margaret Whitmore, a widow in 17th century London, used lead-based cosmetics daily for nearly 20 years. The white powder she applied to achieve fashionable pale skin was essentially painting her face with poison. She had been a beauty in her youth, known for her clear complexion and sharp wit. Marriage to a wool merchant had secured her social position. When he died, leaving her wealthy but alone, she invested considerable effort into maintaining her appearance. The cosmetics she used was called Venetian ceruse, a mixture of lead and vinegar. It went on smoothly, dried quickly, and produced a flawless white finish. It also peeled off in layers, taking skin with it, which necessitated thicker applications over time. By age 52, she could barely walk. Her hands trembled constantly. She forgot the names of her own children. Conversations became difficult. She would start sentences and lose track halfway through. Servants reported that she sometimes stood in rooms, staring at nothing for hours. When she finally died, the physician noted affliction of the nerves and moved on. No one connected her symptoms to the small ceramic pot of white powder on her dressing table, the same powder her daughter had just begun using. The daughter, Eleanor, inherited her mother's cosmetics along with the house. She continued the tradition. By the time Eleanor was 40, she exhibited the same symptoms: tremors, confusion, irritability. Her own physician, more observant than his predecessor, noticed a pattern. He asked what cosmetics she used. When she showed him the white powder, he frowned. "Do you feel unwell after applying this?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted. "My head aches, my hands shake." "Then stop using it." "But my complexion will recover, or it won't, but you'll live longer." Eleanor was unconvinced. She reduced her use but didn't stop entirely. Vanity, it turned out, was stronger than self-preservation. She lived to 63, which was considered old age. but the last decade was spent in increasing confusion and pain. The cosmetic eventually fell out of fashion, not because anyone proved it was dangerous, but because a new formula became popular. One based on bismuth instead of lead. Bismuth wasn't safe either, but it was new, which made it preferable. At some point, medieval authorities stumbled upon a discovery so effective that it would outlive castles, crowns, and chainmail. Fear is far more efficient than fairness. Laws are complicated. Courts take time. Evidence is inconvenient. Fear, on the other hand, works immediately and requires very little explanation. Once this realization set in, medieval justice quietly changed its priorities. Punishment stopped being about correcting behavior and started being about making an example. The goal was no longer to restore balance or determine truth. The goal was to ensure that everyone watching went home thinking, I will never do whatever that person just did. Ideally, while slightly nauseous. The shift was gradual but deliberate. Early medieval justice had operated on compensation principles. If you harmed someone, you paid a fine. The amount depended on the severity of the harm and the status of the victim. Kill a nobleman, pay his family a fortune. Kill a peasant, pay significantly less. The system was transactional. But by the 13th century, authorities realized compensation didn't terrify anyone. A wealthy criminal could simply pay the fine and continue. Punishment needed to be personal, physical, and public. Public punishment became the cornerstone of order. Executions, floggings, mutilations, and humiliations were carefully staged in central squares where crowds could gather comfortably. Timing mattered. Market days were popular. Nothing reinforced obedience like combining errands with a vivid reminder of consequences. In London, executions at Tyburn occurred on Mondays, which became known as hanging days. Crowds gathered early. The procession from Newgate Prison to the gallows was a public event. The condemned rode in a cart, sometimes stopping at taverns along the route for a final drink. Spectators lined the streets. Some cheered, some jeered, some threw things. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like. Authorities discovered that you didn't need to punish many people. You just needed to punish a few very visibly. Fear spread faster than any decree. People didn't need to know the law. They just needed to remember the sound someone made when it was enforced. Fairness, meanwhile, was optional. Trials were short. Evidence was flexible. Confessions were encouraged under conditions that strongly favored agreement. Guilt mattered less than impact. If the punishment frightened enough people, the system was considered successful. The scaffolds themselves became permanent architecture in many cities. Nuremberg's execution platform, built in the 15th century, was a substantial stone structure with clear sight lines and elevated positions for officials. It wasn't hidden or temporary. It was a monument to authority standing in the city center as a constant reminder. And the crowds, they came willingly. People watched. They whispered. They brought children. They laughed at the right moments and stayed silent at the wrong ones. Fear became communal. It bonded people together in shared relief that today at least it wasn't them. The psychological mechanism was straightforward. Watching punishment created a sense of safety. Order was being maintained. Rules were being enforced. Chaos was being contained. And as long as you followed the rules, as long as you stayed invisible, you were safe. The scaffold was for other people. Criminals, outsiders, the reckless and the unlucky. This illusion of safety through compliance was the entire point. Authority didn't want rebellion. It wanted obedience. And public punishment taught obedience better than any sermon. What made this discovery especially powerful was its simplicity. Fear didn't require literacy. It didn't require explanation. It bypassed reason entirely and went straight for the survival instinct. Medieval authorities didn't need citizens to understand the law. They just needed them to remember pain. This discovery didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. It matured, it evolved. It learned to wear robes, uniforms, and official seals. It learned to speak calmly and call itself order. Public executions continued in Europe well into the 19th century. In England, the last public hanging occurred in 1868. In France, the guillotine operated publicly until 1939. The methods changed. The technology improved. But the principle remained. Make punishment visible. Make it memorable. Make it terrifying enough that most people never test the boundaries. Medieval Europe didn't invent fear as a tool of governance, but it refined it, codified it, built permanent infrastructure for it. And once that infrastructure existed, once fear proved more effective than fairness, fairness quietly stopped being the priority. The legal philosopher Michel Foucault would later argue that this shift from public torture to private imprisonment represented progress. Hidden punishment was more humane than spectacle. Maybe, but it was also more efficient. You could punish more people more quietly without crowds or scaffolds or the risk of execution becoming martyrdom. Medieval Europe discovered that fear works. Modernity discovered that fear works better when it's invisible. After medieval authorities discovered that fear worked, they made an even more disturbing discovery. People didn't just tolerate public punishment, they enjoyed it. And once that realization set in, humiliation became a feature, not a side effect. Stocks, pillories, and scaffolds were placed in central locations for a reason. These weren't tucked away out of decency or respect. They were installed where everyone could see them: markets, church squares, busy crossroads. The medieval equivalent of primetime television. The punishment itself was only half the experience. The crowd was the other half. People gathered early. They brought friends. They brought children. Vendors sold food nearby because nothing pairs better with civic discipline than a snack. In Chester, England, market day coincided with public punishment. The pillory stood in the town square. Merchants set up stalls around it. The condemned would be locked in place while commerce continued. It was multitasking. Buy vegetables, watch someone suffer, buy bread, throw something at the criminal, haggle over fabric, all in one convenient location. The condemned wasn't just punished. They were displayed, labeled, mocked, reduced from person to lesson. Often a sign hung above them listing their crime: cheater of weights, seller of rotten meat, maker of false oaths. The specificity mattered. The crowd needed to know why this person deserved humiliation. And once they knew they participated, humiliation turned out to be incredibly efficient. Pain ended eventually. Shame lingered. Being laughed at by your neighbors, spat on by strangers, and immortalized in local memory did something deeper than bruises ever could. Medieval society learned that destroying someone's dignity was often more effective than breaking their body. The stocks held your feet. The pillory held your head and hands. Both forced you into uncomfortable positions for hours, sometimes days. You couldn't escape. You couldn't hide. You couldn't even defend yourself. And the crowd participated eagerly. People shouted insults. They threw rotten food. They laughed at the correct moments. This wasn't chaos. It was structured cruelty. Everyone knew the rules. You laughed when expected. You looked serious when the punishment demanded gravity. It was community bonding through shared discomfort. Children learn by watching. This is what happens when you break rules. This is what happens when you cheat, lie, or steal. The lesson wasn't taught through words, but through visceral experience. What's especially unsettling is that public humiliation made spectators feel safe. Watching someone else suffer reassured the crowd that order still existed, that rules were enforced, that chaos was contained, preferably in wooden restraints at eye level. Authorities loved this discovery. Humiliation was cheap. It required no executioner skill. It didn't even require lasting injury. All it needed was an audience willing to participate. And medieval Europe had plenty of those. The economic efficiency was remarkable. Building a pillory cost a fraction of maintaining a dungeon. Operating it required one guard to lock and unlock the device. No feeding prisoners, no heating cells, no ongoing expense. Just wood iron and public participation. The condemned were often left for hours, sometimes days, exposed to weather insults and the slow erosion of identity. By the time they were released, the punishment had already done its work. They didn't just leave hurt, they left remembered. Their neighbors had seen them at their lowest, had laughed, had thrown things. That memory didn't fade. Years later, people would still point. That's the one who sold rotten fish, or that's the baker who cheated on weights. The punishment extended far beyond the hours in the stocks. It became a permanent social mark. Some crimes carried additional humiliations. Scold's women accused of gossiping or nagging were sometimes subjected to the scold's bridle, a metal cage that fit over the head with a piece that pressed down the tongue. The woman would be paraded through town wearing this device, unable to speak while crowds mocked her. The message was clear: women who spoke too much would be silenced. The gendered nature of certain punishments revealed what authorities actually feared. Not just crime, but disruption of social hierarchy. Women who challenged male authority, servants who defied masters, peasants who questioned nobles. Public humiliation maintained order by reinforcing who belonged where. The most uncomfortable truth is that this discovery never really vanished. Public shaming just evolved. The scaffolds disappeared, the crowds changed shape, but the appetite remained. Social media in some ways is the digital pillory. The same dynamics apply. Someone is accused. The crowd gathers, mockery ensues. The goal is not correction, but spectacle. The technology changed. The underlying human impulse did not. Medieval Europe didn't just punish crime, it discovered that humiliation could be communal entertainment. And once society learned that lesson, it never fully unlearned it. We just moved it online where more people could participate from the comfort of home. Let's pause here for a moment. We've covered poison that looked like medicine, authority that looked like justice, entertainment that looked like righteousness. What connects these stories isn't ignorance. Medieval people weren't stupid. They were working with the information they had, the tools available, and the incentives that shaped their choices. Mercury looked powerful because it moved in ways other metals didn't. Lead solved immediate problems even as it created slow, invisible ones. Fear maintained order when resources were scarce and institutions were weak. Public humiliation satisfied a human need to see boundaries enforced. None of these discoveries happened by accident. They happened because they worked, at least in the short term, at least for the people making the decisions. The problem wasn't the discoveries themselves. The problem was what came after. The refusal to question, the doubling down when evidence appeared, the prioritization of convenience over truth. Medieval Europe didn't lack the ability to observe. It lacked the willingness to change course once momentum had built. And that willingness or lack of it is what turned useful discoveries into generational catastrophes. The final section of this part takes us from individual bodies to entire populations. From things people chose to consume to things they couldn't escape. We're moving now from personal poison to architectural violence. From what you put in your body to what surrounded you, burned you, confined you, and erased you. The scale changes, but the pattern remains the same. Someone discovers something powerful. Someone else decides how to use it. And the people caught in between rarely get consulted. Let's continue. Welcome to the final part. We've covered what medieval people did to bodies, what they willingly consumed, what they trusted authorities to provide. This section is different. This is about scale. Individual suffering becomes collective. Personal poison becomes systemic violence. And the tools of control move from scalpels and powders to stone fire silence and erasure. The discoveries here aren't about making people sick or afraid one at a time. They're about reshaping entire populations, entire cities, entire ways of thinking. And unlike mercury or lead, which you could theoretically avoid, the things we're about to discuss were inescapable. If you lived in a medieval city, you lived inside these discoveries. They surrounded you, defined you, trapped you. Let's begin. Fire had always been useful. It cooked food, warmed hands, and kept medieval families from freezing into decorative statues. Then someone realized fire could do something else, far more efficient, erase entire cities. And once that discovery was made, it could not be unmade. Siege warfare changed overnight. Medieval engineers learned that fire didn't need to burn slowly in a hearth. It could be launched, thrown smeared onto projectiles, and politely delivered over city walls. Incendiary weapons appeared. Flaming arrows, firepots, and substances designed specifically to keep burning even when everyone desperately wished they wouldn't. The technology wasn't entirely new. The Byzantines had used Greek fire as early as the 7th century. But medieval Europe refined it, expanded it, and integrated it into standard military practice. The most famous example, of course, was Greek fire, a substance so effective and so terrifying that even its inventors were afraid of it. It burned on water. It clung to surfaces. It ignored common sense. The exact formula was a closely guarded secret. Byzantine emperors forbade anyone from sharing it. Chemists who worked with it took oaths of silence. When the empire fell, the formula died with it. Modern historians have attempted to reconstruct it. Most agree it likely contained petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and naphtha. When combined and ignited, it produced a fire that water couldn't extinguish. Pouring water on Greek fire made it burn hotter. The quicklime reacted with water, producing heat and spreading the flames. Once deployed, panic followed immediately because there was no reliable way to put it out. Water made it worse. Smothering sometimes worked. Praying did not. Byzantine ships equipped with siphons could spray Greek fire onto enemy vessels. The ships burned down to the waterline. Sailors jumped overboard to escape, only to find the sea itself on fire. The psychological effect was devastating. Cities that had survived sieges for generations suddenly became flammable problems waiting to happen. Wooden buildings, thatched roofs, narrow streets. Everything medieval towns loved was also perfect kindling. Fire spread faster than soldiers, faster than orders, faster than hope. During the siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1204, English defenders watched French forces launch firepots over the walls. The castle itself was stone, but the interior structures were wood. Within hours, the smoke became unbearable. Defenders couldn't see, couldn't breathe. They surrendered not because the walls fell, but because living inside became impossible. And the psychological impact was immediate. People could fight swords. They could block arrows. They could even endure starvation. But fire bypassed courage entirely. It didn't care how brave you were. It turned homes into furnaces and streets into traps. Once fire entered a city, defenders didn't think about strategy. They thought about escape. Entire sections of cities could be consumed in hours. The Great Fire of London in 1666 destroyed over 13,000 houses. But London was hardly unique. Most medieval cities experienced catastrophic fires at some point. The architecture guaranteed it. Buildings were close together. Streets were narrow. Fire brigades didn't exist. Once flames started, they spread. But accidental fires were one thing, weaponized fire was another. The discovery also changed how people built. Stone replaced wood where possible. Roofs became heavier. Streets widened slightly. But these changes were expensive. Only wealthy cities could afford wholesale reconstruction. Most places simply accepted fire as a periodic catastrophe, like plague or famine. The knowledge was already loose in the world. Fire as a weapon was now an option. And options historically get used. What makes this discovery especially grim is how quickly it spread. Once one army proved fire worked, everyone followed. Warfare became louder, brighter, and far more final. Victory no longer meant taking control of a city. It meant leaving nothing worth controlling. The scorched earth policy, burning crops and villages to deny the enemy resources, became standard practice. If you couldn't hold a city, you burned it. If you couldn't defend a region, you destroyed it. Fire stopped being a tool of life and became a shortcut to annihilation. During the 100 Years' War, English forces systematically burned French villages, not as collateral damage but as strategy. The goal was to make rebellion impossible by eliminating the resources needed to sustain resistance. Thousands of villages were reduced to ash. The population fled or starved. The countryside became a wasteland. The medieval world didn't invent fire, but it discovered how efficiently it could be used to end everything. And once cities learned they could burn, they never felt safe again. Even when sieges ended and wars moved elsewhere, the memory remained. Every wooden building was a potential pyre. Every thatched roof a liability. Fire changed urban planning, military strategy, and the psychological landscape of medieval life. It introduced a new kind of fear. Not the fear of defeat, but the fear of total erasure. And that fear, once learned, became permanent. Medieval authorities were very focused on the body. They measured it, punished it, cut it open, and tested its limits. Eventually, though, they stumbled onto a quieter discovery. One that required far less blood but caused far more lasting damage. The human mind breaks faster than the body. This realization didn't come from compassion. It came from imprisonment. Medieval prisons were not designed for rehabilitation. They were holding spaces. Dark, cold, loud, or sometimes eerily silent. Prisoners were isolated for long periods, often without knowing how long they would remain there or what would happen next. And something interesting happened. People unraveled. Guards noticed it first. Prisoners who had survived beatings, hunger, and disease began to lose coherence after prolonged isolation. They talked to walls. They stopped speaking altogether. They obeyed without resistance. Fear didn't need to be applied physically anymore. The mind did the work on its own. This was efficient. The Tower of London, which served as both palace and prison, had cells designed specifically for isolation. Small windowless rooms deep in the stone foundations. No light, no sound, no human contact except when food was pushed through a slot in the door. Prisoners held there reported when they could still speak coherently, that time became meaningless. Days blurred together. Hallucinations appeared. Conversations with people who weren't there. Some prisoners carved marks on the walls to track days. But in complete darkness, even this became difficult. The marks blurred together. Counting became impossible. The psychological deterioration was predictable and measurable. Within weeks, most prisoners showed signs of cognitive decline. Within months, many became permanently damaged. Authorities realized that uncertainty was more effective than pain. Not knowing when punishment would end was worse than the punishment itself. Darkness was more effective than chains. Silence was more effective than shouting. Once this lesson was learned, prisons changed. Cells became smaller. Light became optional. Interaction became rare. The goal shifted from containment to erosion. You didn't need to break bones if you could dissolve someone's sense of self. And again, this discovery wasn't framed as cruelty, it was framed as order. Quiet prisoners were easier to manage. Broken spirits didn't revolt. Compliance became automatic. The economic advantages were significant. A broken prisoner required less supervision, fewer guards, less food. They didn't fight, didn't escape, didn't cause trouble. From an administrative perspective, psychological breakdown was preferable to physical restraint. What's unsettling is how quickly this knowledge became standard practice. Isolation, deprivation, and uncertainty became tools, not accidents. Medieval authorities had discovered that suffering didn't need spectacle to be effective. It could be invisible. The body healed eventually, broken bones mended, wounds closed, but the mind did not. Prisoners released after prolonged isolation often never fully recovered. They remained withdrawn, paranoid, unable to reintegrate into normal life. Some became hermits, others turned to religion, seeking isolation voluntarily because it was the only state they still understood. This discovery also reshaped confession. People subjected to prolonged uncertainty confessed just to end the waiting. Truth became irrelevant. Relief became the goal. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century to combat heresy, relied heavily on psychological torture. Physical torture was used, yes, but prolonged isolation and uncertainty were more effective. A prisoner held in solitary confinement, uncertain of their fate, uncertain if they'd ever see daylight again, would confess to anything. Heresy, witchcraft, conspiracy, whatever the interrogators wanted to hear. And because the confession was voluntary, extracted, not through violence, but through waiting, it carried legal weight. The medieval world didn't understand psychology, but it understood results. It learned that fear could live inside a person without chains or whips. And once fear moved inside the mind, it became self-sustaining. That lesson would echo long after the Middle Ages ended. Modern prison systems, particularly solitary confinement, operate on the same principle. Remove human contact. Remove stimulus. Remove certainty. The body remains intact. The mind deteriorates. We've refined the technique, made it cleaner, given it clinical justifications. But the mechanism hasn't changed. Medieval Europe discovered that the mind is more fragile than the body, and that breaking it is easier, cheaper, and more permanent. One of the most quietly dangerous medieval discoveries wasn't physical at all. It was psychological. Medieval Europe learned that belief itself could shape decisions more powerfully than evidence. And once that lesson sank in, reality became optional. But more importantly, authorities learned something even more useful. You could control people without chains, swords, or fire. Ideas would do the job just fine. And once that truth surfaced, knowledge itself became a threat. Books were the first warning sign. Medieval Europe discovered that written ideas had a disturbing habit of surviving their authors. A dangerous thought could be copied, shared, read aloud, and repeated long after the original thinker was safely imprisoned, exiled, or dead. This made books uniquely unsettling. You couldn't interrogate them, you couldn't scare them, and they didn't forget what they said. So ideas became suspect. Texts that challenged religious doctrine, questioned authority, or proposed alternative explanations for the world were suddenly labeled dangerous. Not incorrect. Dangerous. The difference matters. An incorrect idea can be debated. A dangerous one must be destroyed. Thus began censorship. Not as an abstract concept, but as a practical solution. Books were banned, manuscripts burned, libraries quietly lost certain volumes. Scholars were encouraged to copy approved texts and forget the rest ever existed. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's list of forbidden books, was first published in 1559, though informal censorship had existed for centuries before. The list included works on astronomy, philosophy, theology, and science. Copernicus made the list for suggesting the Earth orbited the Sun. Galileo followed for agreeing with him. The problem wasn't that these men were wrong. The problem was that they were right, and their rightness threatened established authority. If the Earth moved, then the Church's interpretation of Scripture was incorrect. If Scripture could be wrong about cosmology, what else might it be wrong about? Better to ban the books and punish the authors than risk the question. The irony is that this discovery only made forbidden ideas more powerful. People noticed which books disappeared. They whispered about missing texts. Curiosity spiked. If an idea was dangerous enough to be erased, it must have been important. Reading itself became risky. Owning the wrong book could cost you your reputation, your freedom, or your life. Knowledge stopped being a neutral pursuit and became an act of courage or recklessness, depending on how attached you were to breathing. The philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600 for, among other heresies, suggesting that the universe was infinite and contained multiple worlds. His books were banned, his ideas were declared dangerous, but burning Bruno didn't kill his ideas. It just made them martyrs. What made this discovery especially effective was fear's subtlety. You didn't need to punish everyone. You punished a few very publicly. The rest learned to self-censor. Writers softened their language. Scholars avoided certain topics. Curiosity learned where the invisible lines were. The medieval world didn't ban thinking outright. It simply taught people which thoughts were safer not to have. And that lesson stuck. Universities, which might have been centers of free inquiry, became centers of approved inquiry. Theology dominated. Philosophy served theology. Science served both. Questions that challenged this hierarchy were redirected or suppressed. Professors who strayed too far from orthodoxy found their positions eliminated and their reputations destroyed. The result was a narrowing of acceptable thought, not through direct prohibition, but through incentive. Safe ideas were rewarded with positions, funding, and prestige. Dangerous ideas led to poverty, exile, or worse. Once ideas are labeled, dangerous questioning authority feels criminal. Imagination becomes suspicious. Progress slows not because no one can think, but because everyone is afraid to write it down. The Middle Ages didn't invent censorship, but they discovered how powerful it could be when paired with fear. And once knowledge learned it could get you killed, it learned to whisper. This discovery had long-term consequences. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution. All of these movements had to fight against the structures medieval Europe built to control ideas. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, made censorship harder but not impossible. Authorities adapted. They licensed printers. They required approval before publication. They burned books by the thousands. But the genie was out of the bottle. Once ideas could be mass-produced, controlling them became exponentially more difficult. Medieval Europe built the architecture of thought control. Modernity inherited it and tried with varying success to dismantle it. But the underlying principle remained. Those in power prefer ideas that support their power. Those challenging power face resistance proportional to the threat they pose. Medieval authorities discovered this. Modern ones remember it. We end where we began, with a discovery. But this time the discovery is in absence. When the ancient Greek historian Herodotus traveled through Egypt in the 5th century BCE, he believed he had already seen the greatest monuments the ancient world could offer. He had stood before the pyramids, measured their scale, and acknowledged their ambition. And yet, when he later wrote about Egypt's wonders, he claimed that something else eclipsed them entirely. Not a pyramid, not an obelisk, but a labyrinth. Herodotus described a structure so vast and complex that words barely contained it. A building composed of countless halls, corridors, and courts arranged in such a way that orientation itself became uncertain. He wrote that it contained thousands of rooms, some above ground, others buried beneath the earth, connected in patterns that confused even those who walked them regularly. Guides, he said, were necessary. Without them, one could easily become lost. What made this claim extraordinary was not just the scale, but the comparison. Herodotus openly stated that the labyrinth surpassed the pyramids in wonder. This was not casual praise. For a Greek audience that already regarded the pyramids as near mythical achievements, such a statement carried weight. The labyrinth was not taller or more visible. It was greater because of its complexity, because it was designed to be experienced from within. According to his account, the structure was built of stone, so finely joined that seams were barely visible. The walls were covered in reliefs and inscriptions. Courtyards opened unexpectedly into one another. Doors led not forward but sideways, backward, or down. He described rooms dedicated to different regions of Egypt, each decorated with symbols and images representing that area's gods, industries, and people. The labyrinth, in his telling, was a stone map of the entire kingdom. Walking through it meant walking through Egypt itself, compressed into architecture. The underground sections, which Herodotus claimed he was not permitted to enter, were said to house royal tombs and sacred chambers, places deliberately hidden from the living. His guides told him that pharaohs were buried there along with sacred crocodiles. The crocodiles were mummified and interred in chambers beneath the labyrinth, guardians of the royal dead. Herodotus recorded this but could not verify it. The guards refused to let him descend. Crucially, Herodotus did not describe the labyrinth as a ruin. He described it as intact, operational, known. This was not a lost myth when he saw it. It was a functioning monument within Egypt's landscape. That detail is what makes the story unsettling. If such a structure truly existed, then its disappearance demands explanation. Later writers echoed Herodotus, though none described the labyrinth in equal detail. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, confirmed that a vast complex existed near Lake Moeris, but his description was shorter, less confident. He saw foundations, ruins. Pliny the Elder, writing a century later, listed the Egyptian labyrinth among the great wonders, but relied on earlier sources. He had not seen it himself. By the time Roman tourists visited Egypt, the labyrinth was already fading. Over time, the structure faded from visibility and memory. Unlike the pyramids, it did not dominate the horizon. Unlike temples, it was not continuously rebuilt. Its greatness lay in intricacy, not endurance. Modern archaeology has struggled with the Egyptian labyrinth. The problem is not too much material, but too little in the wrong places. Excavators know roughly where to look. Ancient texts are unusually consistent. The location near Hawara beside the pyramid of Amenemhat III is well documented, but the monument described as greater than the pyramids refuses to reappear in recognizable form. Early archaeological work in the 19th century uncovered vast limestone foundations. These remains were massive, tightly fitted, and far more extensive than a typical mortuary temple. Flinders Petrie, excavating at Hawara in the 1880s, found evidence of a structure covering over 70,000 square meters. The foundations suggested multiple courtyards, countless rooms, and a complexity matching Herodotus's description. But the walls were gone. The rooms were gone. The inscriptions, the reliefs, the doors, all gone. Some explorers immediately suspected they had found traces of the labyrinth. Others were more cautious. The foundations were impressive. But without intact walls, corridors, or inscriptions, certainty proved elusive. One major obstacle is water. The Fayum region has undergone dramatic environmental change since antiquity. Irrigation projects, rising groundwater, and agricultural expansion have saturated the subsoil. Any underground chambers, precisely the parts Herodotus was forbidden to see, are now likely flooded, collapsed, or buried beneath meters of sediment. Excavation in waterlogged soil is difficult, destructive, and often impossible without modern equipment. Another problem is removal. Ancient quarrying stripped the site down to its bones. Later builders were efficient. They did not leave dramatic ruins behind. They carried the labyrinth away in blocks, reusing it across centuries. What archaeology encounters today is absence arranged by human hands, not natural decay. The labyrinth didn't fall. It dissolved. Despite its name, the Egyptian labyrinth was not a puzzle built to confuse wanderers. It was not a test of cleverness or courage. Everything about its description suggests the opposite. This was a machine of order, one so vast and intricate that to an outsider it felt disorienting. Confusion was a byproduct, not the purpose. The labyrinth appears to have been designed to embody bureaucracy physically. Stone corridors replaced papyrus records. Architecture replaced administration. Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, when the labyrinth was likely constructed, was a highly centralized state. Power flowed through administrative regions called nomes. Each nome had its own governor gods and agricultural systems. Coordinating these regions required infrastructure. Not just roads and canals, but symbolic infrastructure. Places where regional authority could meet, negotiate, and submit to central power. The labyrinth may have been that place. If each section represented a nome, then walking the labyrinth meant walking the kingdom. Regional officials would navigate to their section, conduct business, and leave. The pharaoh, standing at the center, controlled access and flow. Movement through the structure was likely controlled. Certain routes were public, others restricted. Doors were not simply entrances, but filters. To pass through the labyrinth was to experience hierarchy firsthand. Where you could go depended on who you were. The building enforced order without speaking a word. If the labyrinth was designed as a bridge between governance and the sacred, then its disappearance was not failure. It was closure. Once its administrative function ended, it lost its value. Unlike tombs or temples, it was not sacred forever. It was practical. And practical buildings, even monumental ones, are easier to dismantle when power shifts. The labyrinth was not a mystery to its builders. It became a mystery only after the system that required it collapsed. When Egypt fell under foreign rule, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the need for a stone map of Egyptian nomes disappeared. The new rulers had their own administrative systems. The labyrinth became irrelevant, and irrelevant monuments, no matter how grand, don't survive. Quarrying the labyrinth made sense. Stone was valuable. Transport was expensive. Why leave massive limestone blocks sitting unused when they could be repurposed? So piece by piece, the labyrinth was dismantled. Its blocks went into fortresses, palaces, churches. The structure that once represented eternal order became raw material for new projects. What remains haunting is the possibility that the most important part of the labyrinth was never meant to endure. Above-ground halls served living systems that eventually ended. Below ground, the purpose was eternal. But once belief in that eternity faded, no one remained to maintain it. The gate was sealed, and the knowledge of what lay beneath was allowed to sink quietly into the earth. The labyrinth's disappearance teaches a lesson about power. Monuments to authority only survive as long as that authority endures. Pyramids built as tombs survive because death is permanent. The dead don't need updating. Their monuments can stand unchanged. But the labyrinth represented governance, and governance changes. New systems replace old ones. New rulers bring new structures. The labyrinth couldn't adapt. It was too specific, too tied to a particular way of organizing power. So when that way ended, the labyrinth ended with it. We're left with descriptions, Herodotus's words, Strabo's brief notes, foundations in the sand. The greatest monument of ancient Egypt, according to those who saw it, is now almost entirely gone, not destroyed in war, not toppled by earthquake, just quietly dismantled because it was no longer needed. That's perhaps the most unsettling part. The labyrinth didn't fail, it succeeded completely, and then it became obsolete. And obsolete things, no matter how grand, don't survive. These stories don't fit into hero narratives. They don't resolve. They don't teach clear lessons. They just are what happened. Medieval Europe didn't lack intelligence. It lacked restraint. Knowledge arrived faster than wisdom. Discoveries sprinted ahead while ethics walked behind, occasionally stopping to tie its shoes. And instead of waiting, medieval society simply kept going. If something worked, it was used. If it controlled people, it was refined. If it caused suffering but maintained order, it was considered a success. This pattern repeated itself endlessly. New understanding appeared. Authority grabbed it. The consequences were addressed later, if at all. What medieval Europe accidentally discovered was a universal rule. Knowledge amplifies whatever values already exist. In a compassionate system, it heals. In a fearful one, it punishes. In a rigid one, it controls. That lesson didn't stay in the Middle Ages. It followed humanity forward into laboratories, governments, technologies, and institutions that still wrestle with the same question medieval people never quite answered. Just because we can, does that mean we should? The medieval world asked that question too late. And the cost of that delay is written all over history. 50 years later, some of these patterns still echo. Not identical, never identical, but recognizable if you know where to look. Fire doesn't destroy cities the same way anymore. But cities still burn metaphorically and literally. Minds still break faster than bodies. Isolation is still used as a tool. Knowledge is still controlled, suppressed, hidden. And monuments to power still rise, serve their function, and then quietly disappear when the systems that required them collapse. The labyrinth is gone. But the impulse that built it, the desire to encode authority into architecture, to make power feel permanent and inevitable, that impulse remains. It just builds different structures now. Make sense of it however you need to. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. I know it's been heavy. I know it doesn't resolve neatly. If you made it this far, leave a comment. Let me know what resonated or just where you're watching from. These stories belong to everyone who bothers to remember them. Until next time. Before we close completely, there's something worth examining. Not a new story, but a thread that runs through all 12. The discoveries we've covered tonight share a common structure. Someone learns something new. Someone else decides what to do with that knowledge. And a third group, usually the largest, experiences the consequences without being asked. This isn't unique to medieval Europe. It's a pattern that appears across cultures and centuries. But the Middle Ages refined it to an unusual degree. Because medieval society was hierarchical by design, everyone had a place. Nobility, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, peasants. Movement between these categories was rare and difficult. So when knowledge appeared, it flowed upward. The person who discovered something rarely controlled how it was used. A physician learns that mercury affects the body. He reports this to his guild. The guild reports to the court. The court decides mercury is medicine. And suddenly everyone from nobles to beggars is being prescribed liquid metal. The physician might have doubts. He might notice that patients worsen rather than improve. But his opinion carries less weight than tradition, authority, and the economic incentives of those selling mercury. This separation between discovery and application created a dangerous gap. The people who understood the details weren't making the decisions. The people making the decisions didn't understand the details. and the people affected by the decisions had no voice at all. This gap still exists. The terminology has changed. We call it policy lag or regulatory capture or perverse incentives. But the mechanism is the same. Knowledge moves faster than institutions. By the time authorities understand a problem, it's already been causing harm for years. Medieval Europe just made this dynamic more visible because the hierarchies were explicit and the consequences were immediate. Another pattern worth noting: belief shaped outcomes as much as evidence. Mercury poisoned people. This was observable. Patients trembled, drooled, lost teeth. The connection between mercury exposure and neurological damage was visible to anyone paying attention, but belief intervened. If you believe mercury was medicine, then those symptoms were evidence of healing, not harm. The trembling was the illness leaving. The drooling was purification. Belief created a filter. Evidence that supported the belief was accepted. Evidence that contradicted it was reinterpreted. This wasn't stupidity, it was psychology. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We build frameworks to understand the world. And once a framework is established, we defend it. Changing your mind requires admitting you were wrong. And if you've spent years prescribing mercury, if your reputation rests on it, if your income depends on it, then admitting mercury is poison means admitting you've been harming people. That's a difficult admission. Easier to find alternative explanations. The patient was weak. The dose was wrong. God willed it. Medieval physicians weren't uniquely stubborn. They were human. And humans resist evidence that threatens their worldview. This resistance appears in every story we've covered. Authorities resisted evidence that torture didn't produce reliable confessions. Cities resisted evidence that quarantine without care was ineffective. Craftsmen resisted evidence that lead and mercury were toxic. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because accepting it would have been expensive, disruptive, and humiliating. So belief persisted, and with it harm. Let's talk about something less abstract: money. Many of these discoveries persisted because they were profitable. Mercury mining was an industry. Lead production employed thousands. Public executions drew crowds that spent money on food, drink, and entertainment. Changing these systems would have cost jobs, revenue, and economic stability. This created a perverse incentive. The people benefiting from harmful practices had resources to defend them. The people being harmed didn't. Mercury miners had guilds. Lead craftsmen had political connections. Executioners had steady employment. The patients dying from mercury poisoning, they were dispersed, isolated, and often too sick to organize. The children developing lead-induced cognitive impairment. They didn't know what was happening to them. Harm was distributed across the population. Profit was concentrated among the few, and in any conflict between distributed harm and concentrated profit, profit usually wins. Medieval Europe didn't invent this dynamic, but it provides clear examples of it. The Venetian glass industry used toxic materials that shortened the lives of workers. But Venetian glass was valuable, exported across Europe, a source of civic pride and revenue. So the industry continued. Workers died young, new workers were recruited. The system perpetuated itself. The same pattern appeared in mining, metalworking, tanning, dyeing. Industries that generated wealth also generated casualties. And as long as the casualties were replaceable, the industries persisted. This is uncomfortable to think about. It suggests that suffering isn't always an accident or a failure of knowledge. Sometimes it's a cost someone decided was acceptable, not acceptable for themselves. They weren't the ones being poisoned or tortured or humiliated, but acceptable for someone else. Here's something that appears in almost every story: the absence of consent. Prisoners didn't consent to torture. Patients didn't consent to mercury. Citizens didn't consent to public humiliation. Workers didn't consent to toxic exposure. Consent as a concept barely existed in medieval legal or medical frameworks. Authority decided. Subjects obeyed. This wasn't considered tyranny, it was considered order. The idea that individuals should have autonomy over their own bodies, their own choices, their own risk tolerance, that idea developed slowly over centuries. It wasn't obvious or natural. It had to be fought for. Medieval Europe operated under different assumptions. The community mattered more than the individual. Authority, whether religious or political, had the right to make decisions for others. This framework enabled many of the discoveries we've discussed. If consent isn't required, then experimentation becomes easier. You don't need to explain risks or obtain permission. You just act. This accelerated learning in some areas. Anatomy advanced because dissection didn't require the corpse's permission. Torture techniques improved because prisoners couldn't refuse to participate, but the cost was enormous, measured in suffering that didn't need to happen, in lives shortened or destroyed without justification. The absence of consent turned people into resources. Bodies became tools. Minds became test subjects. And once you treat people as resources, optimization follows. How much pain can a body endure? How long can a mind resist? How many workers can we expose to mercury before productivity declines? These questions sound monstrous now, but they were practical then, asked by people who saw themselves as reasonable, responsible, and acting in the greater good. That's perhaps the most disturbing part. The people making these decisions weren't cackling villains. They were administrators, physicians, judges, craftsmen, people doing their jobs. They believed they were serving important purposes, maintaining order, advancing medicine, producing valuable goods. And if maintaining order required torture, if advancing medicine required poisoning patients, if producing goods required killing workers, well, that was unfortunate but necessary. The logic was utilitarian. A few suffer, so many benefit. The problem, of course, is who decides who belongs in each category. Medieval Europe's answer was simple. The powerful decide. The powerless suffer. And that answer, however much we might reject it now, shapes centuries of human experience. One more pattern worth examining: bad ideas survive longer than they should. Mercury remained in medical use into the 20th century. Lead wasn't banned from gasoline until the 1970s. Public execution continued in some places into the 1990s. Why do harmful practices persist long after evidence of harm becomes available? Several reasons. First, institutional inertia. Once a practice becomes standard changing, it requires effort. New training, new regulations, new infrastructure. Easier to continue than to change. Second, vested interest. People who profit from a practice will defend it. They'll fund studies that support it. They'll lobby against regulation. They'll cast doubt on critics. Third, the diffusion of responsibility. When many people participate in a harmful system, no individual feels fully responsible. The miner extracts lead. The craftsman shapes it. The merchant sells it. The consumer buys it. Each person is doing their job. No one person caused the harm. This diffusion makes it difficult to assign blame or create accountability. Fourth, slow-moving harm. When consequences take years or decades to appear, causation becomes debatable. Did mercury cause that tremor? Or was it age or genetics? Or God's will? When harm is slow, invisible, and statistically distributed, it's easy to deny. And finally, the absence of alternatives. If mercury is the only treatment available for syphilis, even a harmful treatment seems better than nothing. Once better alternatives appeared, mercury fell out of use quickly, but until then, it persisted. These dynamics aren't unique to medieval Europe. They explain why harmful practices continue today despite available evidence. Because evidence alone doesn't change systems. Change requires pressure, alternatives, and the willingness to admit past mistakes. And those are always in short supply. So what do we take from all this? Not moral lessons. Medieval people weren't uniquely evil or stupid. They were humans working with limited information, perverse incentives, and hierarchical systems that concentrated power and distributed harm. But we can observe patterns. Knowledge without ethics becomes a weapon. Discovery without consent becomes exploitation. Progress without reflection becomes harm. These aren't abstract principles. They're visible throughout the stories we've covered tonight. A physician discovers mercury affects the body. Without ethical guidelines, it becomes poison disguised as medicine. An authority discovers fear controls populations. Without accountability, it becomes systematic terror. A craftsman discovers lead is useful. Without regulation, it becomes environmental catastrophe. The discoveries themselves were neutral. Tools, technologies, insights. What mattered was the system that controlled them. Medieval Europe's system concentrated power at the top and eliminated feedback from the bottom. This created conditions where harm could persist indefinitely. Modern systems are different. We have regulations, oversight, democratic input. These provide friction. They slow down harmful practices and create space for correction. But the underlying dynamics haven't disappeared. They've just become more subtle. Knowledge still moves faster than wisdom. Power still concentrates. Harm still gets distributed away from those making decisions. The language has changed. The mechanisms have evolved. But the pattern remains, and that's worth remembering. Not to draw easy parallels or make glib comparisons, but to recognize that the gap between discovery and responsibility is permanent. Every generation has to navigate it. Every society has to decide how to manage knowledge, distribute power, and protect the vulnerable. Medieval Europe's answers were inadequate. Ours are better, but they're not perfect. And the moment we think they are, we stop improving. Let's return to the labyrinth one more time. The Egyptian labyrinth, as described by Herodotus, was a structure so complex that navigation required guidance. Without a guide, you got lost. You wandered in circles. You never reached your destination. This is a useful metaphor for the challenge we face with knowledge. Every discovery is a corridor in a vast labyrinth. Some corridors lead somewhere useful. Others loop back on themselves. Some lead to dead ends. Some lead to danger. And we're walking through this labyrinth without a complete map. Medieval Europe walked corridors that seemed promising. Mercury looked like medicine. Lead looked like progress. Fear looked like order. Only later did they realize these corridors led to harm. We're still in the same labyrinth, just walking different corridors. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, surveillance technology, social media, nuclear energy. Each is a corridor. Each seems to lead somewhere. But we don't know where until we've already walked far enough that turning back becomes difficult. The labyrinth doesn't provide clear signage. There's no obvious distinction between the corridor that leads to healing and the one that leads to poison. So we walk carefully. We pay attention. We try to learn from those who walked before us. Medieval Europe left markers, bodies in the corridors they walked, warnings written in trembling hands and shortened lives. We can read those warnings, or we can ignore them and repeat the journey. The labyrinth doesn't care which we choose. There's one more dynamic worth mentioning: the tendency to forget. Many of the harms we've discussed tonight were eventually recognized and addressed. Mercury was removed from medicine. Lead was banned from many applications. Torture was outlawed. Public humiliation was curtailed. These were victories, hard-won, long-delayed victories. But they came with a quick forgetting. Once a harm is addressed, it fades from memory. Younger generations grow up in a world where mercury isn't medicine and lead isn't in gasoline. These facts seem obvious, natural, the way things have always been. The struggle to get there disappears. And with it, the understanding of why those protections exist. This creates vulnerability, because protections that seem obvious are easy to dismiss as unnecessary. Why do we need regulations on medical testing? Obviously, doctors wouldn't harm patients, except they did for centuries, until regulations forced them to stop. Why do we need environmental protection? Obviously, companies wouldn't poison their workers, except they did, repeatedly, until laws made it expensive. Forgetting the past makes it easier to repeat, not identically, but structurally. Medieval Europe forgot the lessons of Rome. Rome had learned that lead was toxic, but that knowledge was lost. Medieval Europe had to relearn it. We've learned lessons medieval Europe paid dearly for, but we're already forgetting some of them. And the labyrinth is patient. The same corridors remain, just waiting for us to walk them again. We've reached the end. 12 stories, 3 themes. One long walk through medieval discoveries that shouldn't have been made. But calling them mistakes implies they were accidental. They weren't. Someone chose to open bodies without anesthesia. Someone chose to measure pain systematically. Someone chose to prescribe mercury. Someone chose to use fear as governance. These weren't errors. They were decisions. Bad decisions, yes, but decisions nonetheless. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the center of all this. The problem isn't that medieval people didn't know better. Often they did. The evidence was available. The harm was visible. The problem is that knowing better didn't stop them, because other priorities intervened: profit, power, convenience, ideology. And those priorities haven't disappeared. They've just found new expressions. We still face the same questions medieval Europe faced. What do we do when knowledge reveals something dangerous? Do we suppress it, regulate it, unleash it, and hope for the best? What do we do when progress harms some people while benefiting others? Do we accept that cost, compensate the harmed, stop the progress? What do we do when individual rights conflict with collective needs? Whose rights matter most? Who decides? Medieval Europe answered these questions badly, but they answered them. We're still answering them, still struggling with the same tensions. The labyrinth remains. The corridors multiply. The choices get more complex. But the underlying question stays the same. Just because we can discover something, should we? And if we discover it anyway, what do we do next? Medieval Europe shows us what happens when those questions are answered without care, without ethics, without regard for consequences. The bodies piled up, the suffering accumulated, the harm spread across generations. We can do better. We have done better in many ways, but better isn't solved. The labyrinth still stands, and we're still walking through it, hopefully with more care than those who came before. But care alone isn't enough. It also takes courage. The courage to stop walking when a corridor leads somewhere dark. The courage to turn back even after investing years. The courage to admit that not every discovery should be pursued. Medieval Europe lacked that courage. Or more accurately, the people with courage lacked power, and the people with power lacked courage. That dynamic persists. The question is whether we can change it. Whether knowledge this time can be paired with wisdom before too many people pay the price. Medieval Europe suggests the answer is no. Not because change is impossible, but because it comes too late, after the harm is already done. But history isn't deterministic. Patterns don't have to repeat. We can learn, we can adapt. We can build systems that catch problems earlier, that distribute costs more fairly, that prioritize people over profit. We can. Whether we will is a different question. One we're still answering, one corridor at a time. That's where we'll leave it. 12 stories about medieval discoveries, about knowledge without wisdom, about power without accountability, about progress that looked like poison. None of it resolved neatly. None of it offered clear lessons. Because history doesn't work that way. It doesn't provide morals or guidance or reassurance. It just shows what happened. And sometimes if you look carefully, why? The rest is up to us. If you've made it this far, truly thank you. This was a long journey, heavy at times, uncomfortable frequently, but worth taking, I think, because these aren't just medieval stories. They're human stories, about the gap between what we know and what we do, about the distance between discovery and responsibility. That gap still exists. We're still navigating it, and remembering how badly it can go wrong is part of learning to do it right. Leave a comment if something here resonated with you, or if you disagreed, or if you just want to share where you're watching from and what time it is. These conversations matter. They're how we make sense of the past and maybe avoid repeating the worst parts of it. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And maybe think twice before trusting anyone who says they've discovered something that will change everything. Because they might be right. And that's not always a good thing. The labyrinth is still there. The corridors are still dark. But we have the benefit of seeing where others walk before us. What we do with that knowledge is up to us. Good night. Everything covered tonight comes from historical record. The dissections, the torture techniques, the mercury, poisoning, the lead exposure, the public punishments, the censorship, the labyrinth, all documented. Sources include medieval medical texts from Bologna, Paris, and Salerno, guild records from various European cities, legal codes including the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, eyewitness accounts from plague survivors, including Boccaccio's Decameron, mining records from Kutna Hora and other sites, alchemical treatises, many anonymous. Herodotus's Histories Book 2, Strabo's Geography, Pliny's Natural History, archaeological reports from Hawara and the Fayum region. The interpretations are mine. The facts are not. If you want to dig deeper, those sources are available. Many are translated. Some are surprisingly readable. But I'll warn you, the deeper you dig, the worse it gets. Medieval Europe was not a romantic era of knights and castles. It was a grinding, brutal, often arbitrary time to be alive. The discoveries we've covered tonight aren't aberrations. They're representative. And that's worth keeping in mind. Not to judge medieval people harshly. They were doing the best they could with what they had, but to remember that the best they could still caused enormous harm. And to ask ourselves honestly, when future generations look back at us, what will they see? What discoveries will they wish we'd never made? What systems will they examine and wonder how we tolerated them? What harms will seem obvious in retrospect but invisible to us now? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they're the right ones to ask, because the labyrinth doesn't end, it just keeps going. And somewhere ahead in corridors we haven't walked yet, there are choices waiting to be made. Choices that will seem reasonable at the time. Choices that might look catastrophic later. The only question is whether we'll recognize them before it's too late. Medieval Europe didn't. Maybe we can do better. Or maybe 50 years from now, someone will be telling stories about us, about the discoveries we made and shouldn't have, about the knowledge we gained but didn't know how to use, about the labyrinth we walked into confident we knew the way out. Time will tell. It always does.